Well, all right. Welcome to one last history video this week for you. We're going to kind of take a look a little bit at some of the backdrop of what happens in the 1920s and early 1930s that sets up the rise of the Nazis and fascists in the mid 1930s and ultimately leads to, or early 30s, and ultimately leads to, and it ultimately leads to World War II and the Holocaust and all the terrible, terrible things that come upon the world during that time. But first, before we get into the events in the aftermath of World War One over in Europe, I just kind of want to talk a little bit. I had y'all skip the chapter or the lesson on some of the that was called post-war uncertainty. That was about some of the cultural stuff, but I want to kind of hit some of the highlights of that because the cultural history is not unimportant. Obviously, history classes tend to focus on the military side and the political side, and and everything. But obviously, the mood of the mood of the people and the mood of artists and philosophers does have an impact on things. So I don't want to completely skip over that stuff. So if you had one word to describe kind of the intellectual mood of the world in between the world wars, the word uncertainty is probably a pretty good word for it. So you got a few major kind of social revolutions happening. One, in science, you have Albert Einstein discovering the theory of relativity, where he discovered, I'm not going to try to venture too far into scientific territory because, I know my lane here a little bit, but ultimately he found out that space and time were not as separate as we thought they were, that, that there's actually, whether it's space or time is kind of relative to all the, to these different factors, how fast you're moving and all this kind of stuff, completely undoes our entire understanding of how physics even works. We've had one idea of how physics works since the days of Sir Isaac Newton. Obviously, we've found out, more details about things. But Einstein and his, theory of relativity completely undoes the whole scientific foundation of Newtonian physics. And every scientist in the world has to go rethink fundamentally how the world works in major and important ways. Meanwhile, you've got the rise of the science, arguably science. Some people would say it's more pseudoscience in the case of the early days anyway. But the rise of the practice of psychology really comes into being with the influence of a thinker by the name of Sigmund Freud. Freud believed that all human activity was really the result of unconscious urges. I don't want to go much further than that. Freud's a little bit of a perv. Not exactly the nicest theories in the world. But he basically thought that that kind of unconscious urges and repressed emotion and stuff like this is the driver of all human activity. And he calls people, and of course, most psychologists now will even psychologists will go back and say, actually, Freud was kind of an idiot. I remember, almost all Freudian theories have been discredited at this point. I remember, walking into my college psychology class the first day, and day one, it's we got to tell you to take that Freud stuff and throw it in the trash can. So, pretty much disproven. But he does start the idea of psychology as a discipline, and then a lot more competent people are going to follow in his wake and start studying the way that the human mind works, and that has a big impact on culture in a lot of ways. I mean, in some ways, some of it is. In some ways, some of it is kind of creates. Psychology done wrong can create excuses for activity, but at the same time, it also gives us a lot of insight into some things as well that are very helpful. So, it's kind of a mixed bag. You can learn some really helpful things through psychology, but there's also some aspects of psychological thought that have been harmful at times. Meanwhile, in the arts, there's. You had this shift towards a lot of pessimism after World War I. And where that's important is that if you remember, the world going into World War I had this real false confidence, this real sense of, we have figured the world out. Look at us, we're inventing medical breakthroughs. We've just invented the airplane. Cars are a thing now. There's, democracy spreading in different places. there's the sense that we have perfected civilization, and it's only getting better. And then World War One happens, and it's the worst tragedy maybe in history, certainly in modern history. And after this, there's this kind of radical pessimism begins to affect. Radical pessimism begins to affect the arts. It begins, in my opinion, it begins to affect theology. I mean, just a whole bunch of different fields kind of take a hard shift towards a very pessimistic worldview. There's this famous line from a poet, Yeats. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. And that was kind of a description of the kind of the way people thought what was happening in the world. And you can understand why that's happening, because we're going straight from World War One, after a brief respite for America, but not really a respite at all for Europe, into the Great Depression, and then from the Great Depression into the rise of Nazism, fascism. Simultaneous to all this is the rise of communism in Russia, and then yet another war that's even worse than World War One in terms of numbers and devastation. So very hard times at this point. There's there's kind of an important idea in philosophy that becomes known as existentialism, which I'm not going to try to go give you a lecture on existential philosophy either, but the idea behind it was kind of that there was no real universal meaning of life, and so man has to kind of make his own meaning. And there's kind of a Christianized version of that associated with certain Kierkegaard and people like that. But the most famous proponent of this is a radical atheist and all-around nasty fella by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche. He's a German philosopher who, he famously, wrote essays claiming that God was dead and so forth. And Nietzsche basically said there's no real meaning of life except the will to power. And he said he thought that he was a major opponent of Christianity, and he believed that the idea of teaching that selflessness and caring for others and restraining your impulses and all these sorts of Christian ideas were actually imposing cowardice and stuff. And so he kind of thought that basically that being a moral and ethical person wasn't manly enough, more or less. And so he basically, he has this idea of, what he called an Übermensch or a Superman in English, where, who he expected to be someone who would kind of revive the image of the conqueror and all this kind of stuff. And so this idea that someone needed to kind of, restore vitality to kind of a culture that he looked at as cowardly and so on. And this philosophy really winds up having a big impact on some very, very bad people, like Hitler and Mussolini, who kind of build on some of this thinking to say, we'll create a meaning for the world through the German or Italian state, and the purification, and in the case of the Germans, the purification of the German race and so on. And so, so really, this philosophy is a major contributing factor to, what kind of happens with World War II and the Holocaust and all these things. I mean, in the back of all that, obviously this is, Darwin and Origin of Species is 50 years old at this point, but we're also starting to see the fruit of a generation of people, the first generation of people that are trained up as children to believe that they weren't necessarily created by God, that they emerged through random processes, wound up adopting this kind of nihilistic, or that word means kind of believing in meaninglessness. This kind of view of a meaningless existence, that they have to create some kind of meaning through it, through some sort of extreme or totalitarian politics, and that's a big part of why people get trapped into Nazi and fascist ideology. And so that's a particularly devastating thing. Again, on this topic of uncertainty, you have, the shift in the arts. You start having people like Picasso, the painter, and stuff like that, who starts making these kind of like surreal paintings that don't actually look like anything. It's just, dabs of paint in different ways, and some of them are interesting in their own right. But it's very much a different way of thinking about what art is than what it had been for most of the last history, really. So it's all representing this whole the world's falling to pieces and we don't understand it kind of thing. But meanwhile, a lot of this is happening kind of in high intellectual circles. At least in America, the 1920s were a time of relative prosperity. The Americans kind of reverted to a kind of more of an isolationist view for much of the 20s. They didn't want to get really involved in European affairs, and that may have been a mistake in hindsight, a lot of people believe, but since obviously some important things were happening in Europe at that time, obviously. But nonetheless, they kind of focused on getting back to work. You have Warren G. Harding, who follows Woodrow Wilson as president, runs on the ticket of a return to normalcy. Basically he's saying after 20 years of we didn't talk much about American politics in this class. We'll talk about it more next year in American history. But at this point, that was the end of 20 to 25 years of what they called the progressive era. Where the government became a lot more aggressively expansionistic and so forth. Harding just says we're going to go back to normal, and people vote for him, in droves. And so Harding, and then he dies in office, and he's succeeded by Calvin Coolidge, who's one of the more underrated presidents. During the 20s, America has a brief recession right after World War I. When we come out of that, most of the 20s are kind of a boom time. You have the rise of kind of mass consumer culture in a new way. You have, the automobile really becomes affordable. Henry Ford, who founded the Ford Motor Company, develops the assembly line, which is a new way of doing a factory where instead of sitting there and trying to make a car, one person puts in a chassis, and someone adds in a tire, and long story short, each person does one job on a number of different cars in a day, and it winds up being able to crank out a lot more cars, which means they're cheaper to make, which means you can sell a lot more of them. In particular, the Ford Model T becomes the first kind of car that is affordable to the average American, and starts to proliferate. Air travel starts to get going. There's a pilot named Charles Lindbergh who wound up being kind of a bad guy, Nazi sympathizer and stuff. But before anybody knew all that, he had briefly become an American hero by becoming the first man to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. He flew from nonstop. So he flew from New York to Paris, if I'm not mistaken, in one shot. It took him an extraordinarily long amount of time compared to the planes we have today. The movie industry really gets rolling. Pro sports industry, takes a step forward, with the invention of talking films and stuff like that, and the invention of the radio in particular. The radio starts to come into people's households. So you could actually hear sporting events live if you weren't there for the first time, as well as music. Normally not recorded music yet. Most of the time it was played live, which is how the Grand Ole Opry, for instance, gets started. In Nashville, Tennessee, or oftentimes they would even have radio shows where they would basically act out plays on the radio, make sound effects with shaking cans and stuff like that to make different sounds and so on. So America, a lot of consumer culture, economic prosperity, stock markets booming. It is the Prohibition era, which sees the rise of organized crime become a major factor in American cities through the profitability of bootlegging. But America has a fairly prosperous 1930s. But the same cannot be said of the European countries who hadn't entirely. I said 30s, I meant 20s. And we had a fairly prosperous 1920s. 30s were not prosperous. But the same cannot be said of the Europeans. So the Europeans, a lot of them have political instability in the years after the war. There's a lot of what they call coalition governments where, especially in France, where no political party is able to get enough of a majority, so they're having to kind of form temporary coalitions. A lot of them had complicated multi-party systems. Germany tries briefly for the first time a republic, which is known as the Weimar Republic. Up until this time, Germany has remained a pretty authoritarian country. They went from the Holy Roman Empire to the Russia of the Kaiser and Bismarck, and that was a fairly dictatorial country. So they've literally never had real democracy. The Holy Roman Empire, you had, the Electoral College was kind of able to vote on an emperor, but they were the elite of the elite, who were able to have a representative voice. So this is the first time that they've tried any sort of republic in Germany, and it doesn't go well. In particular, the failures of that government lead directly to the rise of one of history's most notorious villains, in Adolf Hitler. And so the beginning of Germany's troubles here is a massive, massive inflation crisis. So inflation, so some laws of economics here. So the value of everything is related to its supply and demand. If a lot of people want something, so for instance, 6 months ago, if I tried to sell you a package of toilet paper for $17, there's not a man in America that would have bought it. But if I bet that I could do that now, right? Because all of a sudden, there's this major demand for toilet paper that is more than anyone had ever been, used to, right? So the laws of supply and demand apply to money as well as individual products. So if there's a lot of money in circulation in the economy, then each individual dollar means less in terms of purchasing power. So inflation is where the money supply goes up, the purchasing power of the dollar goes down, and what that means is higher prices for everything. In your grandparents' day, you could buy, a loaf of bread for a few pennies. Now we've had so much inflation that, you couldn't, it's hard to find anything you can buy for, less than $1 now. So Germany gets hit with hyperinflation. And the reason it happens was because they were stuck. We talked about this at the end of World War I. They were stuck with this war guilt clause where they were found responsible basically for the whole financial ramifications of World War I. Which, as much as I hate the Kaiser's government, it was probably not fair to say that he was the sole cause of it. I mean, that was a comedy of errors. Anyway, the Americans had lent a bunch of money to the British and French for them to pay back when the war was over. The British and French wanted these reparations payments from, was what they called them, reparations when you're basically a type of restitution or whatever. They wanted the reparations from Germany, but they had to get them fast because America was expecting to be paid back. Well, it created this crisis where we're leaning on the British and French to pay us back, but they're not really sound yet either, so they're leaning on the Germans to pay them back. Well, the Germans have no way to, because there's some flashpoints along the way where there was, some French troops were along the border and nearly degenerated into, nearly another war. It was about to be a mess. Ultimately, Germany's response that they have to do is they just start printing money to pay it off. And so what happens is they had to print so much money to pay off this debt. All this money is basically fake money. It doesn't actually buy anything. And so what happens is the rate at which the purchasing power of a mark, mark is the Deutschmark is their version of like the dollar. The value of the Deutschmark was shifting so dramatically within a day that if you got paid at noon, you didn't wait until 6 o'clock to go to the grocery store, because by 6 o'clock, half the value of that paycheck may have dissipated. It literally was changing by the hour. And so people literally, it was so expensive that people literally would have to go to the grocery store with wheelbarrows. They would take wheelbarrows full of cash to go to the grocery store. They didn't have credit cards yet or anything like that. They'd take wheelbarrows full of cash to the grocery store because, they needed all of it just to buy basic things. There's a picture in your textbook, which I hope you saw the other day, if you've been following along, which you're supposed to, on page 905. There's a picture of two German school children who are literally building a fort with stacks of money. Like, the money was so worthless, the parents are like, whatever, go play, build this little pyramid with our stacks of worthless money that we can't buy anything with. So, let me quote from your book here a second, that so in Berlin, a loaf of bread cost less than 1 mark in 1918. In 1922, it cost more than 160. So from 18 to 22, it went over 160 times the value. But by 1923, to buy a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Perspective. 1918, a loaf of bread is 1 mark or less. We'll put it in ways that you can understand. Imagine, like right now, it's right around $1. To buy, a candy bar at the gas station, right? That's being a little generous, and a lot of them are $1.15 something now. But let's just say it's $1. So it's $1 to buy a candy bar at the front. 6 years later, that same candy bar cost you $200 billion. That's the level of inflation that they had. It's unbelievable. Unbelievable. And so this, needless to say, this causes widespread poverty in Germany. And Germany's not been typically a poor country. I mean, they've been a pretty modern, a pretty industrialized, pretty prosperous country. Now there's just massive wave of economic trouble comes from this. This is the danger of national debt, because eventually the way to pay off the national debt is to cause massive inflation, and that's bad for the economy. So in steps an American diplomat banker named Charles Dawes, who was charged with the Americans to set up what he calls the Dawes Plan Commission, or the Dawes Commission, and they tried to figure out some sort of way to maintain stability in Germany by working with American banks to help the Germans pay off the British and French. So it's this weird cycle where we're demanding the Allies repay us. The Allies are demanding the Germans repay them. The Germans can't repay them, so they're getting money from us when we were causing the problem really by insisting on reparations from the Allies. I mean, it's a complicated mess. Kind of stabilizes things for a little while. But then the Great Depression hits. And it starts in the U.S. and it spreads all across the world because American investment was propping up this little game. If you're really interested in this, you can watch the Great Depression video I made for the other class. That goes into a lot more detail than I'm going to go here about what caused it. But basically, the stock market in the 20s had just gone up, and people were starting to just buy stocks with too much optimism, thinking that it was never going to come down. And somewhere around 1929, people start to realize that a lot of these stocks are overpriced compared to the amount of profit they'll actually be able to bring in real terms. And a lot of people had bought these stocks on credit in kind of an irresponsible way. Long and short, some things happen and the stock market collapses in the United States. And this is followed with a whole mess of other things. There famine hits in the West, called the Dust Bowl. American agricultural prices had already been kind of in the toilet due to overproduction. With new, thanks to some new technologies and stuff, you have just a wave of bad things happen. One of the most important things is a run on the banks, because you may not know this, the way banks make money is they don't actually have all of everyone's posted account money in the bank at one time. A percentage of it gets invested in the stock market, and that's why they pay you interest for leaving things in a savings account, is because they actually are borrowing your money to invest with, and they know it's okay because, and this is why you sometimes have limits on how much you can pull out of a savings account at one time or what have you, because they know, well, not everyone's going to go ask for all their money on the same day. Well, the day the stock, shortly after the stock market crashed, people did start to do that because everyone said this could go bad, and so you have a lot of banks literally go out of business, and with it, all people's, if you ever wonder why that a certain older generation just doesn't trust banks, a lot of it is because that generation, quite a few people saw their entire retirement and life savings vanish in a moment. So very stressful time. leads to unemployment that is sometimes as bad in the United States as 1 out of 4 people being out of work. And that's only typically unemployment statistics only count people that are searching for work. So this is not even talking about the fact that a lot of people were, housewives and stuff like that at the time. We're talking about 1 out of the 4 of the people that want to be working couldn't find a job. That's astounding. Hope we're not going there again. So God bless America, help us, Lord. So anyway, with all that, I mean, people had a hard time eating and all this stuff. I mean, in a lot of cases. Well, guess what was propping up this whole Dawes Plan arrangement? American investment from American banks that are now falling on hard times. The American economy crashes, and honestly, the American economy was kind of propping up the world economy to a certain extent. And so when that happens, the crisis spreads to Britain, it spreads to France, it spreads to Scandinavia, it spreads to Germany. And Germany had only just started to recover. They have this terrible period of hyperinflation. They recover just a little bit, and then boom, their economy is like down in the tank again, in a powerful way. And so this is going to cause a lot of Germans to get desperate and to want revenge on the allies that they blame for the situation. And that deep desire for revenge and that deep sense that the Germans didn't deserve this situation, and it was brought around by treachery. And in particular, a lot of Germans, there's a long history of German anti-Semitism, which is a word for anti-Jewish prejudice. A lot of them started to use the Jews as scapegoats for what happened in World War I, which is absolutely ridiculous, but that's never stopped, anti-Semites before. They've been accused of some of the strangest things throughout history. And so that's a big part of how the Nazi Party rises to power, is riding this wave of resentment toward the German economic situation. And then from that wave of resentment caused people to look for people that they could blame. And from that, looking for blame, comes the scapegoating of the Jews, and which leads to the Kristallnacht and then the Holocaust and just all these terrible, terrible things. So, 1930s, rough decade, bad times for a lot of people all across the world, and a time of great, great instability and uncertainty. So, anyway, on that happy note, this is just the happiest lecture of all time, right? On that note, I'll see you next week as we're going to begin to actually move into World War II. So, y'all take care. Have yourselves a good day.